Hi, everybody. I'm here to talk today about file structures and understanding your file system and working directories a little bit better, because this is something that I've seen in class, people continually stumbling over and being confused about. So the first comment I want to make is that it's really important that you understand the basic structure of your file system. So whether you use a Mac or a PC, things will look a little bit different, but fundamentally it's the same thing. You have a nested set of folders or directories on your computer, and within these directories live files. And so I know this seems like a really basic concept, but it's also just really important because it's the foundation of everything that comes next as you're running R code and interacting with R scripts and R markdown files. So you probably somewhere in your system will have a folder that has your username. On my computer, it's called Nick. And then within that, maybe you have a documents folder. So what I'm going to encourage you to do, and what we've encouraged you to do from the outset of this class, is to create a new folder in this directory that's associated, that has some relevance to this class. So maybe you call it PH460, or maybe you call it telling stories, or something like that. Whatever your choice is, it's up to you. It doesn't matter what it is, but you have to have a designated place that's a designated directory for this class. So the way I did this in this case was to create this directory here, and then right now it's empty. But as the class goes on and as you accumulate documents in this folder, you will have additional files and data in here. So for example, one of the things we've asked you to do is to create another folder in here called code, and maybe another folder called data. So this file directory, this file system is accessible from different places on your computer. So here I am in an RStudio session that is not currently associated with any project. And in here, you can see the same file system that's on your computer, just shown in a slightly different graphical interface with a slightly different navigation. So here, the home directory is the same directory over here as this Nick directory. So it's often thought of that the user's home directory is that sort of root directory that has your name. So this home directory here corresponds to the Nick directory over here. So if I go to documents, and then here is my telling stories folder with my two empty subfolders. So to create a project in this folder, I'm going to say, I want to create a new project. I want to associate a project with an existing working directory. So note that there are other ways to create projects. You can either start a new directory, start a project in a new directory that you have not yet created, but I'm specifically showing you a way to create a project and associate that project with an existing directory. So I'm going to browse. And here I am back in a navigation with my file system, and I'm going to say I want it to go to documents, telling stories. And now I'm going to say create a project. So R is going to reset. And now here I am in telling stories, and you'll note that RStudio has added this file called .rproj. And this file is actually just a text file that holds some preferences, project-specific preferences that RStudio can read. But in general, you don't need to use or update this file. It just lives there in the home directory of this project. So now here in this little navigation, in these, I think what they're often called breadcrumbs, you can see that this is the address of this project. This is the address of this directory, this telling stories directory, and this is the root directory of this project. So when you're running R code, anytime you run a command, it's run in the context of a working directory. Now, some commands that you run in R, like if you're just doing some simple addition or some simple plot command, those doesn't matter what directory you're in when you run those commands should just work. But the moment that you try to run a command that includes another file, then it does matter what directory you're in. And a lot of you are getting error messages that say things like, I can't find this file. There's no such file or directory. And that's because whenever you have a command that is specifying a file name, knowing where the context that you're running this command in and what R is seeing as your current working directory is critical, and it won't work unless this file is in the working directory that you've specified here. So the idea of a working directory with a project is that in general, when you're starting your project, this folder will always be the working directory of the project. So sure enough, if I type in the command getwd, that stands for get working directory, it tells me that users, Nick, documents, telling stories is the root directory of this project. So I'm going to just quit RStudio for a minute. And I'm going to go back here to my folder again, where here I have Nick and documents and telling stories. And here is my telling stories.rproj file. So if I open this again, sorry, it opened on a different window. If I open this again and I type getwd again, my working directory is still the root directory of this project. It hasn't changed. And any time I open RStudio and I open this R project, this is always going to be the working directory. So what that means is that I want to, this is helpful because it gives you a common reference point for any code and data that you load in this directory. So I want to say with projects, the idea with projects in this class are that you should just have to create this one project for all of your individual coursework. It's possible that when you do a group project, you might want to create another RStudio project for you and your classmates to work on. But for all of your individual work for this class, you will have just this one .rproj file, just this one directory that houses this project. So all of your assignments and stuff should live in here, and you don't need to create new projects every time you do a new assignment. So if you're ever in a pinch and you need to change your working directory, you can do it something like you could navigate to the data directory and say set as working directory, and then that would set. So now if you get the working directory, it's now, because you just set it as the data directory, now it says, now R is set, knows that this is the directory relative to which all files should be read. But in general, you don't want to do that. You don't want to mess with the working directories. You want to just let the project do it for you. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take from a different directory, I'm going to take a CSV file that is saved on my computer, and this is the gapminder file, and I'm going to copy it in here to my data directory. So now I have a CSV file that lives in this project. And sure enough, when I go here to gapminder.csv, sorry, when I go now to the data directory, I will see that I have this gapminder.csv file in there. So once again, if I try to do something really simple, like this is not going to work. So I'm trying to read the CSV file in, and it's saying, I can't find gapminder.csv, even though I'm like, but it's right there. But it says, I can't find that file because what it's doing is it's looking for gapminder.csv in my current working directory, which is telling stories, not telling stories/data. So the way to fix this is to use a relative file path and to say, well, from where you are, from where you are, computer that's running R, you need to find this gapminder file by looking in the data directory, and that's where it is. So now, sure enough, that works. I read in my temp file, and now here is the gapminder data read in as a data frame. Okay, so So it's really important that you understand whenever you're running R, what the context is that you're running that job in and what R sees as the working directory. So there's one other important piece here, and that is when you're running an R Markdown file, things get just a little bit more complicated. So by default, R sees R Markdown files. R runs R Markdown files, not in the root directory of your project, but in the directory where that file lives. So I just opened a new R Markdown file, and I'm going to save this file in the code directory. So this is I'm going to say my homework.rmd. And so now that file lives in telling stories / code, my homework.rmd. So if what I'd like to do, I'm going to delete some of the extra stuff that's here. And I'm going to say, R, I'd like you to read in gapminder.csv. So if I try to knit this, it's not going to work because it can't find that CSV file. If I go to output, it says it cannot open the connection. So this is another way, another type of error message that you might see from R if it's having trouble, if you haven't specified the right directory. So the default situation for RStudio is that when you run an R Markdown file, it uses the directory where that file lives as the working directory for knitting a document. So when you run an R Markdown file, it's opening a new R session and running all the code with the working directory that is the directory where this R Markdown file lives. So this address for this file is not good enough for a file that's in code, because in code, there's no data folder. So when I run this R code and this gives me an error, this is saying, hey, I can't open this connection because there's no data directory here. And so the way to fix that is to use a special kind of syntax where you say ... and that says when you're in code, go up one directory. By up one directory, we mean like go to the parent directory of code. So that's telling stories. And in there, you should find data. And then in that folder, you should find gapminder.csv. So if I knit this now works. So the thing that is complicated about this is that when you are running R Markdown, and if you're trying to run this chunk of code here, remember that by default, your console is going to think of the working directory as the root directory of your project that's telling stories. Whereas this Markdown file is going to see the root directory as your telling stories code folder. So you need to do one of two things. One is manually at the beginning of the session, you could go to code and say, so if I just try to run this chunk here, let me erase this because that's hanging around from a previous session. If I try to run this chunk of code, it can't open it because even though this is the right directory for my R Markdown file that's in the code directory, it's not the right line of code when I'm in my R session, which remember has a working directory of the Telling Stories project. So one option is if you're trying to do all of this and not go insane in an R Markdown file is you could go to code and set your code folder as your working directory temporarily, and then this chunk will now work. Or another option is to go to your profiles, go to tools and to go to global options. And then if you go to R Markdown, you can choose to evaluate chunk to have the default behavior be to evaluate chunks in the project folder. And that way, no matter where your R Markdown file is, it will always evaluate based on the root project directory. So that would be another option if you know that this is what you want. But I think the default behavior is that RStudio evaluates chunks in the directory that is the document directory. So this is a confusing stumbling block to using R and R projects and R Markdown notebooks effectively, but it's really important that you take the time to understand how these directories work and how they matter and why it matters when you run into these really common problems about knitting files and having getting errors like there's no such file or directory. Hope this is helpful and happy to answer any questions in office hours. Thanks.